Hey guys, welcome back to another Guardians of the Galaxy video, and today let's take a look at the combat and how it functions in this game. I actually got a chance to test all of the abilities during my time with the game and took notes of pretty much all of them and how they interact with each other, how they affect the enemies, and how you can make the most out of them to create some really awesome combat moments. Now, what most people don't realize is that there's quite a bit of strategy involved in this game and quite a few systems that you need to keep an eye out for if you want to fare well and not like get completely overwhelmed by big groups of enemies. So let's jump into it, and as always, a thumbs up on the video would be super appreciated. Now let's get one thing out of the way, which are gonna be these ability points. So essentially it's pretty straightforward. Every 1000 XP points will grant you one ability point, which will then use to unlock skills from all of the Guardians of the Galaxy. Each of the Guardians of the Galaxy have about 4 abilities that you will get to unlock, and that would be about 20 in total. So that means you will have to be at least level 20 before you unlock all skills and abilities for all of the Guardians, including Star-Lord himself. And let's get started with Star-Lord because he has some additional skills on top of the other Guardians, since he is the main character that you get to play with. So his first skill is gonna be called the Vantage Point. Star-Lord initiates a prolonged burn of his jet boots, rising to a tactically advantageous position to give orders or attack enemies. And just like what this implies, you get to fly up into the air for about 10 to 20 seconds, and it's like super useful against some of the ground attacks coming from enemies, especially that electricity attack you just saw passing beneath him. Yeah, that's one of the advantages. The other one is the fact that you can also still continue to use your regular attacks with the blasters and with the melee attacks, but with the exception that the animations are changed since you're now flying up into the air. And there's also another flight related perk you can unlock at the workbench, but that's a little bit different. That only works when you're jumping and aiming, and it works for a lot less longer, but it also doesn't have a cooldown, so we will talk about that a little bit later in the video. His second ability is called Fan the Hammer. Star-Lord unleashes a rapid fire blaster shot, dealing heavy damage spread across one or more enemies. It essentially locks you in this position right here, and you only get to control his aim, but you're unleashing a flurry of bullets, dealing super high damage at 1 or 2 targets. This is normally what I would use following a full stagger or stun of the enemies previously, unless you want to get damaged right into your face. So I would be careful with this ability, but its trade-offs definitely are worth it for the damage that it deals. His third ability that we got to see is called the Eye of the Hurricane. Star-Lord spirals up into the air, lobbing several grenades at the enemies below. All foes caught into the blast area receive moderate damage and heavy stagger. So this is a pretty straightforward ability. It looks a little bit more flashy than the previous ones, but it's super useful when you're kind of surrounded by big groups of enemies, which can happen quite a bit. So you just pop this off, deal super high damage, and also stagger many of these enemies, which yeah, is something that you will definitely want to do a little bit later in the game. Nonetheless, Peter has other tricks up his sleeves, as I've said, and the other one is gonna be his elemental blasters that you pull off with the R1 on the controller. During my hands-on session, we only had access to the ice shot ability, which is this one right here, but eventually you will get to unlock an incendiary, an electricity, and a wind attack as well. This is all part of that combat strategy I was talking about earlier, as all of these enemies will have different weaknesses to different elementals, and you can see those weaknesses right next to their HP bars. For example, in the chapter 5 that we got to play, all enemies were weak to ice elemental, so that's why we use that ability so much. We also got recent footage of the wind elemental and how it works. Essentially, you shoot it at a target and it immediately pulls that target right in front of you, making it very well suited against some of the snipers or enemies that throw bombs that usually tend to stay really far back and are super annoying. Oh, and before I forget, these elemental blasters also get used during puzzles. There's gonna be many moments during exploration where you will have to freeze certain elements or burn them down to open up areas ahead. Nonetheless, let's move over to the second character, which is gonna be Rocket, and possibly my favorite out of all of the Guardians, not just because of the banter, but mostly because of his kit. So his first devastating ability is called the Cluster Flark Bomb. Rocket blasts all enemies caught in a radius around the initial target with moderate damage, and I'm gonna say this, that damage definitely definitely didn't feel moderate. You can see one of these shots right here with a perfect setup where the entire enemy team is kind of like staggered into place, and then you hurl one of those grenades with rocket and immediately blasts and melts away about 3/4 of all enemies' HP values. And this is consistent with what I've seen during my hands-on session, and sometimes even completely wiping up multiple enemies at the same time. And yeah, this is like one of my favorite over there, but of course his kit includes so much more. His second ability is called the Gravistack Grenade. Rocket launches a grenade at an enemy, drawing others towards the initial target's position and grouping them for a follow-up attack. This ability doesn't deal any damage or any stagger, it just groups up enemies and spins them a little bit into the air. So I found this to be super useful against these key moments when I would normally be overwhelmed by the number of enemies. The third ability is called the Glowing Pains Grenade. So Rocket lobs a grenade that releases several darts on impact, and these shots will deal light stagger to each enemy for a short duration. Enemies affected also take more stagger damage while under this effect. Now there's also a fourth ability that we finally got a chance to see. There's no description of it yet, but it is called the 5-Barrel Barrage, where Rocket pretty much unleashes his entire arsenal of rocket launchers, of grenade throwers, of like super machine guns and everything else in between in a flurry of attacks that deal devastating damage against big groups of enemies. The next character is Gamora, and she excels at single target damage with most of her abilities. The first one is called the Deadly Strike. Gamora does heavy damage to a single target enemy. Essentially, she jumps into the air, she does a backflip, lands on the enemy, and she deals very high powerful damage against it. We don't really have any footage of that, unfortunately, but it looks pretty flashy. The next one is called the Shadow Strike. So Gamora dashes between enemies, striking each one once and dealing moderate damage. If only one enemy is present, she will attack it several times. Now this ability looks very similar to the Executioner number 4 ability that kind of looks like this, except it doesn't throw enemies up into the air, but those jumps between targets or on the same target still happen, kind of like how they are shown right here. The third ability she has is called the Stagger Wave. Gamora strikes a single enemy, dealing moderate damage, followed by a wave of energy that deals moderate stagger to all enemies behind the initial target. And the AoE on that second moderate stagger is really big, like almost the entire arena covered depending on your position, and it's super useful if you have a lot of enemies at the same time to deal with. There's also a final ability called Executioner that we don't have the description of, but it looks something like this, as I've said previously, so really close looking to the Shadow Strike with the jumps and whatnot. Yeah, let's move over to Drax, because he is the king of staggering and disabling enemies. His first ability is called Destroy. Drax hits a single enemy with a powerful attack, dealing light damage and heavy stagger. And the way this looks in practice when I played was he was doing a bunch of kicks and slashes, followed up by a drop kick that looked really awesome, so super useful at both damage and stagger. His second ability is called the Catathian Charge, and he kinda charges forward, dealing moderate stagger to all enemies in a line. The damage is nothing to speak of, but like the stagger and that momentarily stun that enemies get is super useful when you're going up against multiple groups in a line. The final one we saw was the Pound and Pummel. He jumps into the air, shatters the ground, dealing moderate damage to an enemy and light damage to nearby enemies. This is one of the best setups when it comes to unleashing some of the bigger ultimates or attacks that you have with Quill or some of the other characters. But let's move over to Groot. He is the king of rooting enemies and entangling foes at the same time. Entangle is also his first ability. Groot grapples multiple enemies in place, and it kind of works like this. If you have a group that just spawned, you can immediately immobilize them all at the same time, and you can further combo this up with some of the other high damage abilities, especially with Rocket. Groot and Rocket have such amazing synergies together, it's unbelievable. His next attack is called Uproot, and it's one of his only damage abilities. He essentially kind of like makes these spikes appear from beneath the enemies, dealing high damage and some good stagger. His final one is called the Mammoth Grab, and this is kind of like the same version of the previous Entangle one, except it only works on single targets and it can be used from range. So in this case, it can hold up a single target for a really long time, making it perfect against some of the elites in the game to deal high damage and take them down more easily, while also disabling some of their shields. We also saw his fourth special attack, or should I say revive, because the next one is called the Gift of the Flora, and it's essentially going to resurrect you in combat, which is super useful if you don't want to restart the previous checkpoint, which can totally happen if you don't have this. Now, these are the attributes. This is something that you have as active abilities, but there's also perks. Now, perks kind of work like passive unlocks that you unlock at the workbench, and you do so with the help of Rocket. You can find the workbench either on the Milano, which is your main ship, but also sometimes during the levels and missions that you play in. And they essentially give you access using components to all types of passive abilities. Some of them will just give you like boost to your HP and your shields, while others will give you new functionalities. Like for example, the rapid reload, negate cooldown period due to an elemental gun's overheating. It essentially gives you the possibility to kind of shoot at the proper time to completely bypass the overheat and kind of like do a more powerful attack. This is also how you unlock the air glide ability I was talking about earlier in the video, where you can glide around targets for a short time while you're shooting, which also doesn't have any cooldowns, and it's like super perfect at dodging incoming attacks. And there's many more in there that will make perfect dodging a little bit easier. Or there's also a knockdown dash where you can avoid falling prone by dashing when hit with a knockdown blow, and there's others in there too that you will notice in the perks section. All in all, these are not the only abilities that each of the Guardians have. As I've said, they can also interact with various environmental objects. Like we already saw that Drax can hurl these explosive barrels at the targets when you prompt them, but during my gameplay session, I also noticed that Gamora can cut down lines to throw like stuff onto enemies' heads. There's also a number of other really interesting team combo attacks, and these are going to be called flare attacks. Now, you can do these either solo or with a team, and they look something like this. Especially after you have staggered an enemy or during special prompts, you can press that button, which is usually either the circle or like circle and triangle at the same time, to do this devastating team combo that will take out the remaining of the enemy's HP. This is mostly used against some of the brutes and bosses in the game. And there's also a final ability that we haven't talked about, which is the huddle. This is kind of like the ultimate. You activate this with L1 and R1 when your huddle bar is fully filled, which is this kind of like purple one onto the right corner of the screen. So when you use this ability, you get to call all of your teammates into a group and kind of like talk to them and motivate them for the fight ahead. It's also a good way to kind of like reset everybody and also revive them in combat. And there's 3 possible outcomes depending on which answer or dialogue choice you pick. You can either get a big buff to damage and to cooldowns for both you and the Guardians. On the other hand, if you pick the wrong option, you're only going to get that buff for Quill and not the remainder of your team. And finally, if you win, lose, or say nothing, all Guardians are resurrected. It also plays really cool music in the background while it's happening, so it's like really awesome, and you can also spam your abilities against targets. You can really like make a full mess out of the entire battlefield during that huddle moment. Now, all in all, this is kind of like most of the combat that we've seen. The only other combat element we haven't talked about, because we don't have too much information on, is the space combat. You can essentially fly in this game with the Milano, and there's like cool arcade combat sequences in space, but we don't know the full extent of it yet, and we also didn't have access to any of it during my hands-on session, or at least I didn't know how to activate that, if it was even possible. But otherwise, this is it with the combat. Sorry it took so long, but there was quite a bit to explain. As always, if you want to stay up to date with anything Guardians of the Galaxy related, drop a like on this video, maybe even subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.